Hey, what's up everybody? First and foremost, I want to thank Laughing Sofa, I believe that's your common username, for your video on tail cuts. It's what prompted this video's creation, so I owe you for generating the idea for this one. I expressed on Twitter my dissatisfaction with the evidence and conclusion of Laughing Sofa's video on tail cuts. The video is called Tail Cuts Are Getting Worse. A few of my followers explained what they believed the video was saying so that I could get a better understanding. Essentially, what it's saying is that many members of the Monster Hunter community believe that tail cuts have gotten worse throughout the series. What does this mean, though? From my understanding, a percentage of the Monster Hunter community believes that, 1. The section of the tail that you can sever is too small on newer monsters, and more monsters should have tails you can sever. Not enough of them have it. There's obviously a percentage of the community that is indifferent to the tail cut situation. They don't believe in either of these things. I'm in that camp. So the topic of people being dissatisfied with tail cuts is new to me, and I want to explore the history of tail cuts and maybe try to understand why people are so dissatisfied with them in World and Rise. First, I want to run basic data. There are trends within the Monster Hunter roster. Certain monster types are more prone to tail cuts than others. But before I list them, I need to lay out ground rules on what is considered a tail cut. From my understanding, the community generally considers a tail cut to be when a section of the tail on a monster model is severed from the main model and falls to the ground as a carvable entity. So Diablos' club at the end of his tail, when that's cut off, it's considered a tail cut, but Rajang's tail being cut in half is not a tail cut, that's considered a part break. Alright, so then which monsters have tails you can sever and which do not? I made this quick tier list that categorizes them by generation and whether the tail can be severed. I didn't include subspecies or variants. It's just like the main species with the exception of like Rathian and Rathalos. They're considered separate monsters, whatever. Here's what I gathered. Piscine wyverns, fang beasts, amphibians, and anything within the realm of crabs or bugs either doesn't have a tail or the tail cannot be severed. Oh, and King Shakalaka, obviously, he doesn't have a tail either. With the exception of Yangaruga and Puke Puke, you cannot cut off the tails of any bird wyverns. So we shouldn't necessarily expect to cut off Giratodus' tail because that's against Capcom's traditions. On the flip side, with the exception of Kezu, Giganox, Legiana, and Paolumu, you can cut off the tail of every flying wyvern. Similarly, with the exception of Nibblesnarf and Somnicanth, you can cut off the tail of every Leviathan. Fanged wyverns and elder dragons are mixed. It is context sensitive. It depends on the monster. The other thing I picked up is that there seems to be a pretty even split in each generation of monsters that can have their tail cut off and monsters that cannot have their tail cut off. In Gen 1, out of the 18 monsters, 7 tails could be cut. Gen 2, it's 9 of the 22. Gen 3 is 13 of the 25. Gen 4 is 9 of the 22 again. And Gen 5 is an even split, 20 out of 40. That's 38%, 40%, 52%, 40%, and 50%. So the average is around 44%. And that looks relatively consistent to me. Alright, so I can confidently say that Capcom has not been cheap with us. Actually, they've been giving us more tail cuts since Gen 1, because Gen 1 had the lowest. They've also been quite consistent, so this leads to our first argument to cover. Should Capcom break tradition and allow us to cut off the tails of monster types that traditionally don't allow it? I'm going to answer that with the discussion on why Capcom chose to give monsters choppable tails to begin with. Guys, read any of Monster Hunter's early design books and you'll see them talk about this. It's in the same philosophy of carving and breaking parts of the monsters that would later be used as materials for weapons and armor. And in some concept images, this act is quite violent, where the monsters are basically being hacked apart mid-combat. There's an important interview about the overall game design, so I'm just going to read this here. It's between Fujioka and Kanbei and an interviewer. I'll just read it. When did you bring in the idea to have the characters use pieces of the monsters they kill for their equipment? Right from the start, wasn't it? Yeah, I remember it being around from a very early stage. I remember seeing an illustration early on that showed that very thing. The character was standing atop a defeated Lao Shenlong, trying to remove this one saw-like part that used to be part of the Lao Shenlong design. I remember that piece. That guy was really going at it with vigor. We didn't want the fun of the game to be over along with the battle. We also knew that going out to hunt a flying dragon wouldn't be satisfying if you went home empty-handed. Souvenirs added another layer of fun to the hunt. We started adding shells and such to the monsters because of that. We thought showing the process of skinning a monster would be a bit much, so we added things that the player could remove without feeling icky about it. Massive fangs, for instance, would be easy for players to see as solid and void of nerves. The shells were easy to remove and not too cruel. That's probably one of the first instances where our plans for game direction had a noticeable effect on gameplay. Although no one remembers this monster, one of my favorites, the Panther Dragon, had notes specifically about cutting off its whole wings during combat. And then these would obviously be gatherable material like the tail. They even made notes for the modeling team that there should be several dead models, where like some models would be cut in half and whatnot. If you look at the early development footage of Monster Hunter 1, there are pools of blood on the ground after you slay the monster. These are obviously not present in the final game. Probably the most violent act in the original Monster Hunter is the ability to chop a whole Velociprey in half. But that has been gone. They've not added that back. So what's the point of all this? Why am I showing you all this? It's to show you that Capcom doesn't exactly want a game where you're violently cutting off large chunks of the monster. I won't show a picture or a video of this because it's gross, but in real-life biology, there are certain lizards that have a natural self-defense mechanism to lose their whole tail when threatened or when they're snagged by a predator. The animal loses the tail cleanly, with no blood loss and the ability to regrow the tail. Notice how all the monsters that have tails that can be severed happen to be reptilian? Capcom doesn't want the player to feel icky or cruel when battling the monster. The monster will always get back up and continue to try to kill you even after losing its tail. This means that mammalian and fish-like monsters tend to not have tails you can sever. You'll notice on all the mammal monsters, Capcom has actually added hard shell bits that can break off instead, or tufts of fur that can be broken off. Breaking the horns or antlers off a deer or pulling out some feathers off a bird is less outwardly violent than cutting off a whole wing or other body parts. Capcom is not going to break this tradition, not under normal circumstances. Cutting off the tail was the least violent part of a wyvern to chop off. If you can't do the head, arms, legs, or wings, you can at least cut off the tail. And again, usually the tails were hardened clubs anyway. The objective of the game was to use gathered materials from the monsters and turn it into weapons. The hardened club of a Diablos that's a weapon. That's way better for a weapon compared to the soft tail of a Congalella, which you can't really make a weapon out of. And so in the case of a monster like Bishaten, the tail is literally a hand, or a foot, a paw. It uses it in a bunch of its attacks. It would require extra time and resources to program a version of Bishaten that has no tail, like after you've cut it off. And it's much easier to just limit the player hunter's ability to chop it off to begin with, than having to deal with making that extra model and pouring those resources into a completely different part of the fight. And besides, cutting off his tail would be gross, because you're cutting off his hand, basically. That's overly violent, and it's against their design philosophy. There's a huge chance that the reason why we don't chop off some monsters' tails is simply because the player hunter has no reason to. Yangaruka's tail is far more deadlier than Yankutku's tail, and would serve to be more valuable in crafting. So severing Garuka's tail makes logical sense for 2 reasons, while Kutku has less reason to have a tail you can sever at all. This moves into the next argument. Aside from monster types that traditionally don't lose their tails, what about monster types that do traditionally lose their tails? Why does Capcom not let us chop off Tobi-Kadachi's tail? So each monster is context sensitive. Using Tobi-Kadachi as an example, Capcom decided that it would affect the fight too much if you could actually sever it. Other fanged wyverns have tails you can sever, but not Tobi. Lunagaron is the same way, and Great Jagras is another one. There, I'll concede. I don't know the reason why they decided not to, continue that tradition, other than it's the same as Yankutku, that there's no reason for the hunter to cut it off. I can also assume that they believed it was just unnecessary, or it just didn't look right for the fight. Or it would affect the fight or the model in a way that the design team just didn't agree with. I guess for some people this is difficult to understand, but when Capcom makes these choices, there's a reason behind it. There's a good chance they tried it and ultimately said, we don't like this. It really can just be that simple. Another example, Legiana, which biologically uses their tails for flight, I can make the critical assumption that Capcom believed that if you cut off Legiana's tail, it would affect Legiana's ability to reasonably fly. Similarly, monsters like Kezu or Giganox both use their tail in a plethora of animations and actions, so I can understand why they limit us from chopping off their tail. It's the same as Bish-Hatton. I believe this plays into the aesthetic angle that Capcom is trying to maintain with Monster Hunter. If you could cut off the tail of Giganox or Kezu or Legiana, it would turn the monster into a struggling animal that could not properly defend itself or escape or attack. The game would just become brutalization of an animal, when it should always play like a combat situation, where you're fighting a monster that's at the top of its game. A tail cut cannot remove the monster's abilities to kill you, it can only nerf it. And so I guess with some monsters they believe it goes too far, or nerfs too far to the point where it would feel wrong. This moves into the next argument to cover. Tails are important parts of many monsters. Shouldn't Capcom adjust the monsters / gameplay to encourage the player to cut off the tail to affect the combat gameplay? And this is an aspect of the game. I mean, anyone who's played this knows this. Basically every tail cut will affect the monster fight. It'll always affect the range of the monster's tail attacks, and will always give you an extra material drop. It's a core part of the gameplay. I've said this 1,000 times, but in the second-gen titles, if you chop off the tail of an Elder Dragon from the Elder Dragon trio, it would affect their fight immensely. It nerfs their abilities, especially if you've also broken their horns. So I don't really want to have to list every example, because I'm sure anyone who's watching this has probably played the games enough to know that there are countless examples about how cutting off tails or breaking parts will affect the fight, and the game does encourage you to do it. What's important is that Capcom has chosen certain tails to cut off that they believe doesn't outright remove the monster's main attack gimmicks. It only nerfs it to a point where it doesn't feel like you're brutalizing the animal. The final argument, and I think this is the one that people think is the most important one, and I think is the one that Laughing Sofa's video was trying to say. The tail cuts are getting too small. Some monsters just have small tails. If there is nothing really there to begin with, we can't expect a lot to fall off when we cut it. The gimmick with Velkhana is that its tail is a rapier sword. She uses it as a sword. So I would hope that it looks like a rapier sword, and it's, thin design, and it moves like a sword, and she uses it like a sword. That's the design, that's the direction that Capcom's attempting. So if we're chopping that off, it should be like a rapier sword, right? And I guess, if you're asking for bigger tails, there are monsters that have bigger sword tails. Like Glavenus has a big sword tail, Abio Rogu has a big sword tail, and when you chop those off, if you chop off Glavenus' tail, you can see a big chunk of the sword. But clearly you're not cutting off the whole thing, because that would affect the fight to a degree that Capcom believes would be bad. Like, they believe it's just bad. It wouldn't work, because obviously if they wanted you to cut off the whole tail, they'd let you. And besides, not every monster is going to have a big weapon like a club for a tail. This, to me, is a bizarre nitpick. Are we asking for every tail to be like Gravios, to be big? To me, this is in the same vague thought process of Monster Hunter has lost its charm. People say this without actually knowing what they're saying. Reminder, more than half of the cast of the original Monster Hunter did not have tails you could cut. It was only 6 monsters you could cut off the tail. Monster Hunter 2 only added 4 more. It's odd. I feel like some people cut off Deviljho's tail and suddenly declared that as the gold standard for the series. But cutting off Deviljho's tail only really shortens his range. It's not like it completely hinders the monster. You can't really compare that to Puke's tail and say it's gotten worse, because in both cases, severing the tail gives you the same result. It nerfed the monster, and you're getting rewarded for it. Of course the size is going to be different. Puke is a smaller monster. So unfortunately for those who want bigger tails, Capcom is more interested in experimenting with new monster skeletons and designs that don't limit the tail to just be a big club that can just pop off without completely changing the gameplay experience. If you look at Malzeno and Magnamalo, they both use spears for tails, and they use them like they're wands. They clearly don't want every monster to be like Diablos. So this is ultimately personal preference. I'm in the camp of I don't care how big the tail cut is. But if you do, power to you. If you are personally dissatisfied with the quality or quantity of tail cuts, then I don't know what else to say. That's your preference. I believe that if they did add tail cutting to many of the monsters that are missing it, like Tobikadachi or Kongalala, it would go against Capcom's design philosophy. Here's my conclusion from all of this. Monster Hunter players are overly violent. Just kidding. Actually, my conclusion is, Monster Hunter tail cuts are not getting worse. But you know what? In Rise, they kind of downplay the necessity to target and cut off the tail. Let's take Rathian as an example. In Monster Hunter Rise, what is your logical reasoning for cutting off the tail of the Rathian? Well, there's two answers. In combat gameplay, it shortens the range of her tail swipe and backflip attacks. Cool. And in overall gameplay, it gives you an extra material drop. But if you remember, Rise already gives you an extra 3 material drops per monster via Wyvern riding, plus, just random shiny drops all over the place from a bunch of other reasons. So there isn't really much incentive to chop off the tail unless the player specifically needs the tail material, which you can also get from capturing. So let's compare this to Monster Hunter World. Why do you want to cut off a Rathian's tail? Well, in combat gameplay, it shortens the range of her tail swipe and backflip attacks. But also in World, by chopping off Rathian's tail, it removes her ability to poison you with her tail. And then of course, that gives you an extra material drop. And in World, there is, I would say, objectively less shiny material drops in World compared to Rise, so the tail carve thus is more important. There's another thing you get out of this. You can also grill the Rathian tail, or like the tails of monsters, with the chef, and you get well done steaks from it. And this feature is actually reminiscent of Monster Hunter 2, where you actually get rewarded dragon tail after quests against flying wyverns, and you can cook this at the canteen. So yeah, I will say that tail cuts are generally a little bit less important in Monster Hunter Rise from a gameplay standpoint, but I'm sure Monster Hunter 6 will try to correct this. But overall, I don't really mind. I don't really care. That's fine if you do. I don't think that they're going to change. I don't think Capcom's going to change, though. I think this is their design philosophy, and they're going to stay the way that they are, unfortunately. Thanks for watching, and have a good night.